So thanks again to all of our speakers, and we'll open up the floor physically and virtually to questions. Normally the way we do it is rounds of 3, so I'll start with this room and take 3 questions first. We'll get a microphone to you, so if you could raise your hand and also identify yourself for the benefit of everyone else when you have a question. And I'll ask, our speakers to come up to the table, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jess Wilhelm, Return Peace Corps volunteer from Lesotho. I want to thank you for discussing the country variations. Working in Lesotho, I was promoting conservation agriculture, and everyone told me the men are serious farmers, the women just dabble in agriculture. And when I actually went to promote this new method, I found that the men were serious farmers, and for men, it means men are strong, they plow with cattle, big animals, tear up the land, do a lot of damage. Women were thinking not about status and the image of farming, but about productivity. So I wanted to think, what do you see as the potential for women being more culturally or in their attitudes open to innovation, and what are some of the gender differences in agricultural innovations? Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions from the room? Go one there and then over here. Thanks.
I'm Karen Groen. Good morning or afternoon. I have a question for Agnes. Fully agreeing with you on your points about the need for data and for indicators. In the context of the post-2015, post-millennium development goals, do you have a recommendation based on the data that are being collected and that you now have from the DHS and the LSMS ISA and the census on what an indicator might look like related to the gender asset gap?
My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a capital markets consultant. To what do you attribute the unusually high percentage of ownership in Malawi?
Okay, so we have the first 3 rounds of questions on the potential for women and innovation, on the post-2015, some recommendations on data and indicators, and finally on the unusually high stats for Malawi. So maybe I know the one question was specifically directed toward Agnes. Do you want to take that one first, and then we'll rotate around for the others?
Sure. Thanks for your question, Karen. I think that since the MDG type monitoring tends to focus on things at the national and policy levels, I think we need 2 types of data. One is on the policy front, I would like to look to see indicators which look at laws that allow women to own and control different forms of land and assets. And at the micro level, I would like to see more information about the extent to which women own property, not only land, so land and assets, but also get more information about what ownership really means, both sole and joint ownership, and also whether they can control and make decisions on these assets. Of course, this probably requires investment in better data collection, but that's just my dream indicator. I'm going to answer the Malawi question briefly, but I think the other people at the table would know more about this in the field. So Malawi is one of the areas which actually does have matrilineal ownership. So there are matrilineal areas and patrilineal areas in Malawi, and so the high percentage of ownership might be attributable to the matrilineal kinship system. And there are anthropologists here who will be better placed to answer that.
But I haven't been studying Malawi. I think that's a good reason, but I also wanted to point out that that was undocumented ownership, the 37%.
Okay. Carrie, do you want to take them?
I don't know anything about Malawi, so I can't offer any insights there. I do appreciate the question on women and innovation for a couple of reasons. One, because it allows me to speak again about the importance of country-level data and knowledge, and because as the editor of a global report, I'm always looking for globally relevant messages, but there's a real danger in that because of this country level variation. And so if you come with a global recommendation that's not relevant to the country in question, then you're very easily dismissed. So I think that it allows us to rethink that. When we think about women in innovation, this allows me to give a little advertisement for the State of Food and Agriculture 2014, which is on innovation in family farming for sustainable development. And one of the things we're looking at is gender differentials in the capacity of farmers to innovate. And we know that capacity to innovate is linked to many of the factors that allow farmers to be successful. So education, access to markets, access to inputs, all of those things come into play. So we're looking forward to elaborating on that again. And I also appreciated your comment because it brought to my mind one of the most important things that we often forget when we're talking about women in agriculture or gender in agriculture. And that is that most people live in households that are mixed, that are made up of men and women and children and sometimes older generations. And so we need to think in terms of the contributions and complementarities of all of the people in the household.
Okay, great. Now I've noticed a number of people raising their hands in the room for questions, but we actually have 3 virtual ones, so I'll let them slip in at the moment, and then we'll take the next round in the room. So Simone, if you could read off the virtual questions, please.
We have a question from Twitter user Hiro Kami, and this question is for Deborah Rubin. Could you show some specific publications, please? Thank you in advance. And the next 2 questions are from Sharena, who is a gender specialist with USAID, and she's based in the country of Georgia. And she is interested in getting the panel's take on engendering market-oriented agriculture development programs and programming in post-conflict and post-disaster areas.
Before I move on, do you need Simone to repeat that last one at all? All set? Okay, so there was definitely a specific question for Deborah. Do you want to take that one first?
Sure. There's now a huge and continually growing literature on this issue of gender equitable value chains, particularly in agriculture. And I would recommend going to a site that's on the web, which is organized through the Netherlands, which is a NING. It's called, I don't have the direct citation off the top of my head, but I'm sure if you look up gender and value chains NING, you would find it on Google. Also, USAID has a number of publications. There is a handbook which we contributed to, and there are a number of publications and studies which have come out. Certainly the publication that we've been talking about here has the paper on value chains that I was speaking about, and I think that that's enough for the moment, but that'll get you started.
So the remaining questions from the USAID person in Georgia. Terry, do you want to?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting question. You know, what's the role of conflict and other disruptive events in a society, and the possible linkage to transformational change in gender roles. And I think if you look at, not to put a glossy spin on conflict, you know, we don't want to go that far, but when you look at the history of U.S. agricultural development and gender relations, the massive shifts in gender roles in the U.S. are inextricably linked to the changes that came about during the First World War and the Second World War, as women left the farm and entered industrial employment. And so we think similar kinds of social and cultural changes occur in other places as a result of these social disruptions. One of the resistance, the forms of resistance we addressed when we were preparing the SOFA report on gender is that, you know, more traditional agriculturalists would say to me things they would never say in public, but they would say to me things like, well, you know, gender roles, that's all about culture, and culture doesn't change. And you're like, excuse me? You know, have you spoken to your mother lately? You know, gender roles do change, and they change all the time. And so I think the key for policymakers and the analytical community is really to look at these cultural shifts as opportunities, try to find the ways to ensure that the participation of women in cultural space, in economic activities, is protected and enhanced during these periods of turmoil.
Agnes or Ruth, did you have anything to add to either or of the questions? All right, so Schengen, I know that you had another question. Go ahead.
I'm Schengen Fan from IFPRI. Two questions. The one is, in the next 20 or 30 years, the whole agricultural sector, rural areas will be transformed. So lots of people will leave agriculture sector, move to the cities, or engage in non-farm employment. So what will be the implications for your work here, particularly the women's access to assets, to productive services? Probably more women will be left behind. Or how can we also move them out of agriculture sector? The land size maybe will be consolidated. In this case, can women access to that land without ownership? I think somebody mentioned about access without ownership. So that will lead to some demand for institutional innovations. The second question is, the women usually are very vulnerable to various shocks, whether it's weather shocks, market shocks, health shocks, conflicts already mentioned. How can we help the woman to increase its resilience against all these shocks?
Okay, thank you. And we had one question from the back there. And
actually, I have two questions. Sorry. Mara Russell from Land O'Lakes. My first question is, there was discussion about women's ownership of land. Is there a similar study happening with regard to women's ownership of livestock? And are there any differences in patterns, ownership and management? The other question is that in food security, I think in the first study and a lot of the discussion that's been going on, there's this idea that if you produce more, then people will eat more. But quite often there's also the issue of, being able to purchase. And the value of what's produced will quite often translate into greater ability to purchase if that is sold. So is there any differentiation made in terms of value of what is produced by women and men?
Okay, so we technically have 4 questions for the panel to answer. So on agricultural transformation and the implications for your work, on shocks and how to increase women's resilience, on women's ownership of livestock and management of livestock, and on the value and the purchasing power. So why don't we start with Ruth?
Okay. On Schengen's point about the ag transformation, this is a major concern because very often it is men who are migrating. Not always. In Philippines and Sri Lanka, it's women that migrate. But in the majority of places, men are migrating either to cities or even locally moving out of agriculture, just creating labor constraints. And then when women do not have control over the resources, it's multiplied the constraints on. So overall agricultural productivity could really suffer from this. I'll let Agnes take resilience because she's been doing a lot on that. Livestock, yes, there's a chapter in the book, and somebody might want to pick up on more of that. But I want to pick up on the point about food for sale versus, agricultural production for sale versus home consumption. Yes, certainly food security does not depend solely on home consumption. However, we're involved in a project that Deborah Rubin mentioned about gender, agriculture, and assets. And what we find is, not only in our own studies, but in a lot of the literature, that when there is production for market, it is very often harder for women keep control over that income, as opposed to when like Helen Keller projects that are vegetable gardens aimed at home consumption, then even that, when that gets sold, women have greater control over it. It does matter, and I'm sitting next to Agnes with lots and lots of literature, that it matters within the household very often who controls that income for whether that income will translate into food security.
Agnes?
I wanted to address Schengen's point about women's vulnerability to shocks. And I think these are things which are very contextual, because it depends on, for example, the relative exposure of women to agricultural versus other types of shocks. So, for example, we did a study in Uganda and Bangladesh where we were looking at shocks experienced by men and women, and we found that in Bangladesh, for example, it was health shocks which tended to affect women more, whereas in Uganda, agricultural shocks also affected them. And that's because of their relatively higher direct exposure to agricultural risk. I think the point here is that as we look towards building social protection schemes, it's important to look for social protection schemes that women can buy into themselves, whether that is a formal scheme or a scheme where they are able to accumulate assets that they can use for smoothing consumption, access to savings accounts, for example, ability to accumulate assets in their own right. In many cases, women don't have the ability to accumulate those assets, and in many cases also in terms of financial services, there's been a very big emphasis on credit rather than on building a financial system, a suite of financial instruments as a whole, which should enable them to insure themselves against shocks. And I think the area of health insurance is a particular area where insurance for women might be very important, because in Bangladesh, in a particular context which I've studied a lot, there are other ways, for example, for households to be insured against disasters like floods and droughts, because the emergency assistance system works pretty well. But there's hardly any insurance for health shocks, and often it's the case that for these little shocks, women's assets are the first to go.
Barry?
Just a couple of points. Interestingly, the question on livestock, the 2009 State of Food and Agriculture was on livestock, and then, of course, we followed that immediately with the gender report. And it was interesting that we very often know much more about the cows themselves than we do about the owners of the cows and who's caring for them. So that was one of the interesting things we observed. So we did very happily include a chapter in the book on women and livestock and women as livestock owners and keepers. One of the things that we learned is that women very often control smaller breeds of livestock animals than men, and they typically use those animals to produce both income and product for home consumption. And that's one of the reasons why we weren't able, in the little exercise we did for SOFA, and if we close the gender gap in production, we weren't able to take that the next step and look at the market implications and then the economy-wide implications of increasing women's ownership, women's production and control over the assets that they produce. But I think this just indicates that there's a huge research agenda out there that's still unfulfilled. So some bright researchers out there who are looking for topics to work on, I think there's a big potential there. So come on, somebody, attack those numbers, do a better job.
Okay, and Deborah, I see you on it.
Yeah, I just had one comment about Schengen's question, and it's only to emphasize how important it is to think about that future scenario and not to stop our development work at the point where we're trying to get all these women to be very good participants in the value chain at the producer level, but how important it is to strengthen their abilities throughout so that they can meet that transition much more effectively.
Okay. So I know we have quite a number of questions in the room, and I've spotted some over here, but we also have overflow room questions. So I'll take a couple of questions from the overflow room and then come back here. Simone?
The first question comes from Sophie. She's with the World Bank, and she asks, is the feminization of agriculture a myth in the context of migration? Anecdotal evidence seems to suggest women gain more ag responsibility when their male partner migrates. What have the panelists seen regarding the impact of migration on women's role in agriculture? And the second, the questioner is unknown. It says, in terms of land ownership, how did you account for joint ownership when or if the men die or if there's divorce and women would be removed from that ownership? And there's one more from an online viewer who asks, this is from Mary Ahern, and she asks, how are your findings being directed to inform current data collection efforts and strategies?
Okay, so I take that back. We'll just address those questions in this round, and then I promise we'll come back to the room for the next round. So 3 questions on whether the feminization of agriculture is a myth in the context of migration, what happens to joint ownership when something happens to the male and the women are removed from the ownership, and data collection efforts. So any volunteers to tackle those? Okay, Terry.
All right, I'll try to tackle the first one. Feminization of agriculture. This is one of the things we hear over and over and over again. But that conclusion that agriculture is becoming feminized is very often based on one observation in time, and you really can't extrapolate a trend from the basis of one observation. And so I think the answer is that we really don't know whether agriculture is being feminized. It may be in certain areas, it may be during certain seasons, but in terms of a global or even regionally representative answers to that question, I think it's an area where there's still a huge information gap. One observation doesn't make a trend.
So I'm going to rashly try to answer the question of joint ownership if in the case of marital dissolution. I think there are 2 critical issues here. One is, are there documents and whose names are on the documents? So if women's names are on legal document, it's probably less likely that they're going to be kicked out if there's a divorce or death. But I do think that legal rights are often not that well defined. I mean, property rights in the case of marital dissolution are often not well defined and in many areas. And I think there is enough evidence of women being unable to retain land rights in the case of in the case of widowhood, for example. So there is actually my colleague Amber Peterman has done a lot of work on widowhood in Africa using the DHS datasets, and there is quite a lot of widows who end up being disinherited when their husbands pass away. So this is an issue I think that deserves a lot of policy attention, and it's certainly a threat to joint ownership, especially in cases where land is undocumented.
Okay, Ruth? You want to add anything?
On the issue of informing current data collection, I think that's a very, very good one. For example, Cheryl Doss, who was also very active in this book, has been very active with a number of people in the audience here on a UN EDGE initiative to really improve the quality of data and bring in making sure that applies not just that it also applies in the agricultural sector. Another major initiative that we've just been talking about a lot the last 2 days is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index that USAID sponsored for developing, has now been picked up by a number of other NGOs first, but perhaps more broadly. And that one has ownership and control over resources as one of the major domains, as well as leadership, i.e. the social capital. That's one of the things I showed. So I think there are a growing number of initiatives, and IFPRI is part of the hosts a policies, institutions, and markets program that is also working with all of the other CGIAR centers to make sure that their data gets sex disaggregated and really integrates gender. This is important not just for the national statistics, but that it go into the planning for the agricultural innovations. And to take it back to your first question, to really show that, in fact, women are farmers, and we've done some work with the climate change program that shows that women are less likely to know about climate-smart agricultural innovations. But in Kenya, for example, if they know about them, they're more likely than men to adopt them. But unless we design innovations that meet women's needs and make sure that they know about them, then you can't really blame them for not adopting them.
Okay. Deborah?
I would just like to add on the data piece that as a practitioner, one of the things that I see is that more and more projects now are requiring that there be some baseline data collected about these issues, particularly access to assets. And that's a huge shift in just 5 years. So I'm going to attribute that to the publication of the FAO report.
I'll claim credit.
So I'll start with, there's 2 questions up front here. We just need to get a mic here. Yeah, go here first.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Wadsworth from the CGIAR Fund. Actually, Ruth's intuition has already started to answer the question I wanted to make. And the point I was interested in getting the panel's views on was, you've made a very, very clear case for the need to improve women's access to services. One of those services being knowledge, research, technology, evidence, etc. Now, if that service, in terms of the products of research, is biased against women, then even if they get great access to it, it may not do them a great deal of good. And I think that's the point that Ruth was starting to make. So really my question, looking for some suggestions from the panel, given that this is such a fairly priority topic across the CGIAR at the moment, is how do you translate that into research programs, and how do you incentivize and encourage scientists who spend their days peering down microscopes or working on their computers to actually take on board the fact that their research isn't gender neutral, which most of them think it is. Don't forget, it's not very long ago that most researchers thought their research was poverty neutral, and clearly most of it isn't. So I'm really sort of thinking about what is the information, what are the messages, how do we really get those incentives into the research system to take this seriously, given that we can increase women's access, but if they're accessing something which is biased against them, then that doesn't take us very far.
Nathan? Simone?
Thank you. David Lambert, Iowa State University. Thank you for excellent presentations. We know that to get resources directed to this issue, we have to change political will. We cannot change political will unless we raise awareness. So my question to Terry and the others is, to what extent do you see in Rome, from perm reps or from member government leadership in UN member governments, an increased awareness about the need to act in these areas?
Okay, I'll go to this part of the room over here. Sue.
Thank you. Victoria Stanley from the World Bank. And I actually just wanted to pick up on a point that Agnes has already made. And I think in terms of dispelling myths and moving forward with this initiative, I think it's very important that we carefully unpack this concept of ownership. And I know that that's something that you're already doing in your work, and Karen and others, but I do think, and the bank needs to do this as well, that understanding what ownership means to the person being asked is very different perhaps than what we're thinking about it in sitting in Washington and other places, because I may think I own the land because I use it, but in reality, when there's a family dissolution or a conflict or et cetera, I don't. And so I think that as we move forward with this initiative, collectively, all of us need to really consider how we define ownership and how we really understand how that's contextualized on the plot level. So that's all I wanted to add. And thank you very much to FAO and IFPRI for this great work.
Okay, so we'll address those three and then go back to the room for the next round. So from Jonathan on, trying to increase access to knowledge, but what if that knowledge is biased in some way, and how to incentivize producing work that is more gender neutral. From David on raising awareness in general and addressing these things at a more global level. And lastly, how we actually define what ownership means. So any volunteers to start that out? Deborah, you look like
I'll get started. Right, I'll get started on this one. I mean, the Gates Foundation has done some work in the ag portfolio, and they have this nice little piece. Unfortunately, it's not public, but it goes out to their grantees that talks about design for her, know her, design for her, and be accountable to her, right? So those three elements, and it's all about her, the woman farmer. And I think that knowing the end user is the most important piece, which that reflects, so that the extent to which we can transform the agricultural education program so that people who are studying to be ag scientists and ag business people understand that the clients include both men and women, I think is certainly one part of the issue, transforming the ag research program itself so that those messages are continually brought out, so that in the research proposals, that people who are reviewing those proposals or who are supporting those proposals actually ask those questions. I think that's another. And then, of course, there's your own CG award program, which tries to support women scientists and to mentor them and to help them move through the promotion, retention, hiring process in ways that are more equitable. So I think that there are some examples, and they're not that difficult and perhaps not even that expensive, some of them, to put in place, but there does have to be the political will that Dr. Lambert mentioned to make that happen.
Okay. Terry?
I would follow up on those first two questions. Jonathan, one of the most transformative things that has taken place at FAO was a program, a very simple program. Some people thought it was a little silly, but in fact, it really has changed the mindset of very many FAO staff members. And it's a program sponsored by SEWA. Okay, I think they were mentioned earlier, the Self-Employed Women's Association. This is a group in India. They have, at last count, how many million?
Millions.
Yeah, millions of members. These are women in all types of businesses, but including farming. Okay? And one of the things they do, because they think it's so important for people in policymaking positions and research positions to really know women, they organize encounter groups, where researchers, so FAO sent people 12 at a time, 16 at a time to India to spend 3 days with a female farmer. And we'd go 2 by 2, two FAO staff members off with a female farmer, 5 hours, by road from Gujarat, just to see what her day is like, what her days are like. And it was really amazing. You see how she's juggling the various responsibilities that she's dealing with, how she's how she's incorporating agriculture into the broader livelihoods that she's trying to accomplish for her family. How she's trying to improve the productivity of her farm with very limited knowledge, very limited assets. It's like the scales fall from your eyes. Okay? So I would recommend that the CG system sponsor male research scientists, because most of them are, to go spend a couple of days with a woman who's juggling her cotton production with her millet production, with washing her sari in the river and looking after her children. It really would change, I think, a lot of mindsets. David, as far as political will, absolutely, you're right that's at the heart of the issue. I think one of the things we found with the state of food and agriculture and the additional research that has flowed from that is that political will can be influenced by evidence, by credible, believable, substantiated evidence. Okay, and so we've seen since the State of Food and Agriculture was published that FAO has shifted in terms of its work priorities. The membership of FAO actually in the budgetary process increased FAO's funding for gender issues by $2 million, which is, in terms of FAO budgeting priorities, that's quite amazing. Nothing increases in the current FAO budget climate. So a $2 million increase for gender work is really quite amazing. The number of female FAO representatives, perm reps in Rome, has increased. It's really quite amazing. It used to be 15 years ago when I started at FAO, all of the representatives, at an FAO governing body meeting would be male, and maybe a junior female who was there to take notes. And that's no longer the case. And that, I think, has really caused a shift in FAO priority setting. Gender issues are now mainstreamed throughout the strategic framework, the new strategic framework of FAO. And I think we're seeing, particularly in partnership with organizations like USAID, that have picked up on gender issues as being so central to development and are really laying that evidence base for future work. I think we're really on the cusp of some exciting changes.
Any other panelists' comments?
Oh, bundles of rights, yes.
Victoria, thank you for the question about ownership. I think from an empirical and sort of research point of view, what we're asking now more and more is when we ask questions about ownership, we also ask about the bundles of rights which accompany it. Like, do you have a right to sell the land? Do you have a right to mortgage the land? Do you have the right to make decisions on what to plant? And also, do you have rights to this land in case a marriage should dissolve? And so I think, this whole complex issues of ownership, really understanding this complex bundle really means that we have to ask questions about the specific things which are in that bundle.
All set? We can go to the next round then? Okay, I have to go to the back of the room this time, I promise. So a couple questions from that.
Thank you very much. My name is Patty Pettish. I've been enjoying the panel. It's just sparking a million ideas for me. I am involved right now in a 9-country study for the World Bank, qualitative, looking at questions of economic mobility. We don't have as large of a rural sample as urban, but in the rural sample, when we ask people, how do you get out of poverty in your community, how has it happened in the past 10 years? And there has been a tremendous amount of poverty reduction in that region. They talk about jobs. And when we ask them in a we asked focus group members closed-ended question, and we had agriculture, farming, cattle raising as options, that was almost the last that got picked as a mechanism for upward mobility. So there's real status concerns that I think need to be addressed to turn around agriculture. Incidentally, it was rural women more likely than rural men to identify that pathway for mobility. The downward story is more interesting. We asked, how do households in your community fall out of poverty? And again, it's a job story, even in the rural areas. And we asked how men fall out, how women fall out. Both heavily a job story, not a drought story, not a health shock, which you find in so many other parts of the world. And this has to do with a wider set of services and safety nets in the region. But you have to punch beneath the numbers, and that's really the point I want to make here, because the numbers only tell a partial story. When people are talking on the ground about falling down or getting out of poverty, they're talking about women. Over and over and over again, even the men will say, I won't do any of the jobs. My wife will do them. I won't work for nothing. I won't work if I'm not sure I'm going to be paid. I won't work these long hours, but my wife can do that. There's all sorts of status issues that surround work at the bottom edge of the labor force that we're still not understanding very well, and I think could help inform our interventions in very powerful ways.
One more toward the very, very back.
Hi there, my name is Liz Buckingham from the Office of Global Food Security at the State Department. I have a question for you that you might not be able to answer or want to answer. I find that I often am given opportunities to input about women in ag and policy frameworks or proposals, whether they be country level, regional level, global level. And generally they're kind of larger ag or development proposals, and we can add kind of a women in ag piece to it. And so I guess my question to you is, looking at the kind of gamut of what we do in women in ag, whether it be access to land, access to inputs, land ownership, women's participation, value chains, kind of the whole, all of those pieces, is there a way to kind of prioritize what the biggest wins are there? I know that we can't do anything in isolation and everything is context specific, so the answer might be no. But in general, if you have some guidance about, if you have, one point that you can put in, what would it be?
You and I'll go to this side of the room. Back, Simone, right by you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Jennifer Bremer from DAI, and I have two questions, and apologies with regard to the first one because you might have addressed it in the innovation panel, but anyway. With regard to the spread of innovations, there's a lot of attention focused on public sector extension services, but I'm wondering about what evidence there is with regard to the gender differences regarding use, spreading through input suppliers or spreading through associations of different types, like about the private sector or CSO channels for the spread of innovation and with regard to gender participation in that. And the second question that I have is what the impact of what the impact of disasters and droughts and migration is on women's roles in pastoral systems, particularly the Horn of Africa, Sahel. I mean, these very vulnerable pastoral systems.
Okay, thank you. So 3 questions, one on pathways out of poverty, employment, and then the status issues surrounding that. Adding a gender, if you have to add a gender element to development proposals, how do you prioritize if you have limited opportunities? And then the spread of innovations and gender participation and the impact of disasters. So Agnes?
I'll take the pathways question. So maybe 5 years or so ago, John Hodinot and I were leading a multi-country study on pathways from poverty. And so we had a chance to do very long panel data sets where very long panels where we looked at things which enabled people to move out of poverty. And this is quantitative work which is also backed up by very serious qualitative work in a lot of the countries that we were working in. And I think it is not surprising that jobs are going to emerge as a key pathway out of poverty for both men and women. In many cases, these were jobs which were secure, like a government job, a teaching job, a job that would provide some insurance against the fluctuations that are commonly experienced by women and men in agriculture. Another issue with regard to jobs was that in many cases, these will often depend upon your having access to schooling. And so I think it is almost an empirical regularity that as economies develop, people are going to be moving out of agriculture, and especially in areas where agriculture has been historically biased against women and where women don't have access to agriculture, don't have equal access in agriculture, it is not surprising that they are going to move. So I think the issue is, from a policy point of view, how are you going to prepare people for mobility, whether they choose to move or not? They may not move, but you want to be able to equip them to make the right choices. And in many cases, investment in education and in human capital, in good nutrition, so that they can build their human capital, is quite important. So I think I'll stop there.
Ruth?
Okay, on the quickly on the issue, Jennifer, about seed suppliers or other sources of innovation, I think there is often a notion that markets are gender neutral, and they're not. Just like public extension systems are gendered, I think it's very important to look at how, in fact, some work we did in Zimbabwe some years ago showed, in fact, that women had far less access to seed suppliers and inputs that way. And for Liz, yeah, that's the very hardest question. The one-word answer I would give is assets. Of course, then you open up that question of what do you mean by assets, but that's what we've moved toward within IFPRI, of focusing a lot of our gender work on, because assets do provide both resilience as well as a way forward. Now, what those assets are and how you prioritize with them depends on where you are, what are the opportunities for doing the livestock ladder from chickens up to larger livestock, versus do you need separate land rights, versus educate the girls so they can get out of agriculture. Those all are context specific. The other thing I will say is that for the Feed the Future countries, one starting point also, now that we have the Women's Empowerment in Ag Index, is look at where the disempowerment areas are and invest in those. Across the board, credit is a constraint for men and women, but then that also gives you, well, these are the areas where opportunities for leadership are missing. Social capital is where you invest. So those are the quick answers. You do have to diagnose, but those are the areas I would look for.
Deborah, you look like you want to jump in.
I'll second the assets point. And I think, particularly for the U.S. government, the focus has for so long been on increasing income as the way to improve women's position. I think that using a broader definition of assets is a more helpful way to think about it. It also allows you to talk about education, because that's partly the human capital piece, so you can cover a number of the things that are usually considered good magic bullets with the word assets. And on the question from Jennifer about the issues of impact of disaster and droughts, the whole question of resiliency, I think that we have the evidence to understand that women are often in more vulnerable positions, but at the same time, if they're given support, they are able to be resilient and to come out. And I think one of the interesting things for pastoral communities is we tend to think of them often, another myth, if we will, that they're very isolated. And in fact, a lot of the really interesting research, including some that's been done by IFPRI and ILRI, as well as U.S. university folks, shows that the relationships between the pastoralists and settled agriculturalists or urban areas has been really critical to allowing them to maintain herds and to maintain movement. And then the issue that Agnes already raised about microinsurance is particularly important for pastoralists and allowing them to maintain their herds to some degree in situations of drought.
Terry?
Yeah, I'd like to just touch on a number of points that have been raised. The magic bullet, well, there is no such thing. But of course, I think the key that we've all been talking about is how do we empower women to make their own choices? Okay? How to pursue what's best for them and for their families. And, we talk about women in agriculture or gender in agriculture, but that doesn't mean we're trying to keep women in agriculture forever. Okay? That's not the point. The point is to enable women to have the assets they need in order to change as the world changes over the next 20 years. For many women, that will mean moving out of agriculture, off the farm, into other types of employment. So bottom line, there are interventions that can be taken in agriculture to make it more gender equal, to promote the ability of women to be more productive in agriculture. But there are also broader policies that will benefit women as well as broader society. And these are things like ensure equality under the law for men and women. Okay? That's the beginning. It doesn't necessarily guarantee equality in reality, but equality under the law. Educate children and women, okay? So that they have the capacity to make the changes they need to over time. And we tend to forget public services that are so important for women. Women spend enormous amounts of time, especially in rural areas, carrying water, carrying firewood, trying to get to a market when they don't have an adequate road to travel on. So investment in basic public services like energy and water and transportation can really be transformative for women and for society as a whole.
So thank you very much to the panelists. I'm afraid we're out of time. So big thanks to everyone, and